on into McDonald's and watch the fastest show in town.
Inside the McDonald's. He is contained, moving around in there. Still shots being fired.
He entered the facility heavily armed, immediately started shooting everybody.
The fastest show in town. Continuous performances daily at your nearest McDonald's.
There are very few corporations that are well known as McDonald's. With the company serving 69 million people every day in over 100 countries, McDonald's is also the second largest employer in the United States, with 17 million employees across the nation, second to Walmart, who employ 2.3 million people. There is almost no one who doesn't know what McDonald's is. It is one of those companies like Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, and Google that pretty much everyone has heard about. And there are few people who have never been inside a McDonald's. Almost everyone has been inside a McDonald's, whether it is to grab a quick bite to eat, or maybe you just want to try McDonald's because you haven't had it in a long time, or just think of all the reasons someone would be at McDonald's. Sometimes parents get pressured into going there because their kids want a Happy Meal, or maybe you just need to use the restroom. However, for the people inside a McDonald's in the San Jacinto neighborhood in San Diego, California, they would unfortunately meet the rage of one man, James Huberty. On July 18th, 1984, James Huberty would walk into a McDonald's and commit to date the deadliest mass shooting in California history. James would kill 23 people and injure 19. But why? From the beginning of his life, James hated everything about humans. He hated interacting with other humans, he hated forming connections with other humans, but most importantly, he hated humanity from the beginning. When he was 3, he contracted polio, which limited his ability to socialize with other kids his age. This was the beginning of his slow descent into loneliness, because soon after he recovered from polio, his father would buy a farm in Pennsylvania. Because his father's new purchase was far from his birth home in Ohio, his mother did not want to move and would abandon the family. After being abandoned by his mother as a kid, and also experiencing isolation due to him contracting polio, he became very withdrawn and viewed everyone with anger, as he was surrounded by kids his age who had everything he didn't have, a lovely family, and physically they could go outside and play. While polio physically impaired him, from an early age, he started to gain a hatred for humanity. His childhood years and teen years were very much uneventful. However, people would always comment about how he was a very lonely man, that he was insecure and suffered from a bit of paranoia, as James always thought people were speaking negatively about him behind his back. Or at school, he thought that teachers and other kids were out to get him. James had very few friends. He didn't find much interesting, and he would often spend his recess inside the classroom. However, from a young age, he had one hobby: guns. For James, firearms were more than just a hobby. He felt like every time he went to the shooting range, he found peace, much like how people describe going to the gym, drawing, playing video games, or any other hobby people have. When he went to the shooting range, it was more than just the excitement of pulling the trigger. He found that shooting allowed him to be excited and passionate about something. He had never felt like this about anything or anyone. James developed such an affinity for firearms that he was able to take apart his pistol, then put it back together, a method called reverse engineering. He had become an amateur gunsmith. His early adult life was very similar to his teenage years. For example, in high school, he preferred to be alone and didn't like anyone. In fact, he hated socializing so much that he didn't even have a high school yearbook photo. It is a blank photo. This was pretty much the same for his college years, but it was even more reclusive because in high school, the staff can sometimes force even the quietest of students to participate. But in college, if you truly want to live a life of isolation, you can, which is very interesting that he decided to even go to college in the first place. I would imagine that someone like James Huberty would skip the college experience, but for whatever reason, he didn't. He would then get his degree in sociology. However, he wasn't able to find a job, perhaps because sociology is literally defined as the study of people, and he hated people, so job opportunities were few. He would then decide to get an embalming license at a mortuary school in Pittsburgh. He would most likely transition into this career path because he wanted to be left alone. James thought that by working with dead bodies, he would finally be left alone. However, it would be quite the opposite, because while he was a very good embalmer, he would rise to the ranks and become promoted to funeral director. Funeral directors are people who join families in the grieving process, as they are part of the funeral and also are expected to be very welcoming people with open hearts. James Huberty would be reprimanded multiple times, as he was the exact opposite of this. He would oftentimes not be seen by families that came to his funeral home, as he was antisocial. He would often rush funerals in so he could spend less time dealing with families. He was a very bad funeral director. So what would happen? He would change professions again. He would become a welder, and just like embalming, he was very good at his job. It was just that when he had to be social and interact with people, he would break down and turn into a horrible person. Lucky for James, welding had little to no interaction. His employer described him as a quiet person, but a very reliable worker, who always did his job, took overtime, and was never late. He was happy to work his way up the corporate ladder, earning promotions on the way up. By the 1970s, he was earning around $25,000 a year to $30,000 a year. So far, James can be described as a man who is quiet, has terrible social skills, but not someone who would fit the profile of a mass murderer. So what happened? Very few people knew about this, but James, he was a very violent man who had a short temper and was extremely paranoid. Early in his life, he was bullied and treated horribly by his classmates for having a dysfunctional family life and being physically weaker than all the other boys due to him contracting polio at an early age, so he grew up thinking that everyone was out to get him. He would always have his guard up and be hostile to most people. This led to him developing deep paranoia. He was a borderline paranoid schizophrenic. In fact, James Huberty was swept up in the nuclear war hysteria, as he was an adult during the Cold War. He believed that the apocalypse was going to happen any day, whether it be the US government or the Soviet government, but he believed he would witness the downfall of civilization. So he stocked up his house with guns and food. He did not trust the Soviet government because they were communists, and he did not trust the US government because in his paranoid mind, he believed that President Jimmy Carter and then later President Reagan were personally plotting against him. Throughout his life, James would be annoyed by everyone. However, during his time in mortuary school, he would meet one person, and that would be his future wife, Edna Markland. They would get married in 1965, and then in 1972 and 1974, they would have 2 daughters. However, while this might look like a normal family, it was anything but a normal family, because James was very abusive. He was physically abusive to both his wife and his children. He would beat his wife regularly, and so often that Edna tried to get help once with the Department of Children and Family Services, but she would later excuse her husband's behavior by saying that he only hit her once. He would also abuse his own 2 daughters. He would punch them, and one time he put a knife to the throat of one of the girls. James Huberty paranoia was so bad that when he got fired from his welding job, he was convinced that this was more proof that the United States government was out to get him. After James Huberty was fired, he would try to kill himself. He would point a gun to his head. However, his wife Edna would calm him down and talk him out of it. This suicide attempt was never reported to anyone. After his failed suicide attempt, he would sell most of what he owned, including his own house, and he would relocate his family to Mexico, not because he thought his money would last longer or the quality of life would be better, but because his paranoia had convinced him that leaving the US would be the only way to escape the US government. Unsurprisingly, he would despise Mexico. He hated that he was the only white person in the city in Mexico he moved into. He didn't even speak Spanish, so he found it hard to assimilate, and when it came to finding a job, it was even harder for him. So after 3 months of living in Mexico, he would move back to the United States. He and his family would move into a neighborhood in San Diego called San Ysidro. When he moved to San Jacinto is when his mental health would take a massive dive. It is not only hard to see that from an early age, James Huberty had mental health issues, but now in 1974, it was at a breaking point. He had gone from earning more than $100,000 a year and living in a nice house, to now just scraping by and living in an apartment. He had fallen from grace, and he blamed everyone but himself. In James Huberty's mind, this is what the world wanted. The world had caused his fall from grace, so the world would have to pay. The day before the shooting, he would call a mental health line and ask to speak with someone who would be able to help him with his mental health. He would talk to someone, however they would write down that he was a non-crisis inquiry, so the San Diego Mental Health Center would call him back in 48 hours. That was on July 17th when he made the call. They were supposed to reach back with him on July 19th. On July 18th, James would take his daughters to the zoo, and during this, he would have a talk with his wife and tell her that his life was over. He was a nobody, and he said, well, society had their chance, referring to the fact that the mental health people hadn't called him back yet. After returning home with his family, he would kiss his wife Edna and tell her, I wanted to kiss you goodbye. When Edna would ask him where he was going, he said, going hunting for humans. He would look at his oldest daughter, Zadia, and tell her, goodbye, I won't be back. At 3:56 p.m. on July 18th, James Huberty would arrive at the McDonald's, and then he would begin his reign of terror. There were 45 people inside the McDonald's. Armed with a pistol, a Uzi, and a 12-gauge shotgun, James would enter the restaurant and aim his shotgun at 16-year-old John Arnold, and James' shotgun would jam, so nothing happened. Believing this to be a joke, the manager of the restaurant would come out, 22-year-old Neva Kane. James would clear the gun and point his Uzi at Neva, shooting her in the head, and shooting John with the shotgun. John Arnold would be one of the surviving victims. Neva would not. She would die. As customers and staff tried to hide anywhere they could, James walked over to 6 women and children hiding underneath a booth. He would shoot Maria Calderon Silvio once in the chest, killing her along with 9-year-old Claudia Perez. He would shoot Claudia Perez's sister, Emilia Perez. Fortunately, she would survive. 11-year-old Aurora Pena would also be injured. However, James Huberty would then kill a pregnant 18-year-old Jackie Reyes, shooting her 48 times. Then James Huberty would shoot 8-month-old Carlos Reyes once in the back. James would then shoot 62-year-old truck driver named Lawrence Vasilius. 31-year-old Blythe Herrera tried to shield her 11-year-old son, Mateo. Blythe's husband would try to protect Mateo's friend, 12-year-old Keith Thomas. Ronald and Keith would survive. Unfortunately, James Huberty would kill Blythe and Mateo by shooting them in the head multiple times. James would then shoot into a group of 3 huddled women, 25-year-old Gloria Ramirez, 24-year-old Guadalupe Del Rio, 31-year-old Aris de Lis Vargas. Gloria and Guadalupe would both survive with minor injuries. However, 31-year-old Aris de Lis Vargas would be shot in the head and later die. Alfonso and Maria Feliz and their 4-month-old daughter, Catalina, would drive up to the McDonald's. James Huberty would shoot at the car. He would injure all 3 people inside the car. Fortunately enough, they all survived. Along with them, 3 boys rode their bikes up to the McDonald's. Joshua Coleman, Omar Alonso Hernandez, David Flores Delgado were 3 11-year-old boys who rode their bikes to McDonald's. James Huberty would shoot all 3. Omar Alonso Hernandez and David Flores Delgado would die at the scene, while Joshua would survive. The last 2 victims were 75-year-old Miguel Victor Oluba and 69-year-old Anita Velasquez Victoria. They would try to enter through the front door, but before they could open the door, James would shoot Anita in the head. Miguel would catch his wife, who instantly died, and cry and swear at James for shooting his wife. James Huberty would then walk over to Miguel and also shoot him in the head, killing him. In total, James would kill 22 people and injure 19.
Well, 35 years later, a community is still in mourning the lives lost in the San Ysidro McDonald's massacre. The shooting took the lives of 21 people.
In total, James would spend 77 minutes inside the McDonald's restaurant. Much like shootings of today, people at the time blamed the police and their reaction time and response. However, there are a few reasons as to why police took so long to stop James Huberty. Reason 1 was that they were delayed by 10 minutes, as the 911 dispatcher gave him the wrong McDonald's address. And number 2 was due to shattered windows. The police officers thought there was more than one shooter, so they thought it was a hostage situation with demands for money. They did not think they were dealing with one mass murderer. When police officers took down James Huberty, they asked survivors inside the McDonald's if he was the lone gunman, as they generally thought there was more than one shooter. However, these are not excuses made to shield the responding officers from criticism, but rather to acknowledge the faults that occurred on that day. But more importantly, we should acknowledge that there is one man responsible for what happened that day, and that man is James Huberty. He was the one who decided to pick up a gun and murder 23 people and leave the 19 surviving victims with scars that will last a lifetime. James took not only human lives that day, but opportunities. The 23 people he killed had the opportunity to start families, businesses, or present new ideas to the world, but they didn't, because one man took that opportunity from them. Ultimately, James Huberty was responsible for his actions. His whole life he went around blaming other people for the circumstances he found himself in. However, he will never be able to escape the fact that he is the man responsible for the worst mass shooting in California's history. And as always, thank you for watching.